All right, welcome to session number 2 of the SBBI 2022 beginners course. And you might ask yourself, why do I have a picture of a bonny beech tree on the screen? Well, if we go right back to very early times, that's exactly where bees lived. This was a beehive. Not the tree per se, but the hole or the hollow in the tree. Now, let's think about the insulation value of timber, which is actually surprisingly high. And in that hollow in the tree, the bees could be surrounded by a foot of timber all the way around through the horizontal axis, and obviously substantial quantities of timber above and below. So it was a highly insulated, cozy environment. Note the word cozy. So from keeping, or rather from having bees in trees, and quite possibly back in the day, I'm thinking really prehistoric man times here, people would have hunted down the wild colonies and smoked them, harvested the honey, and more than likely the brood combs as well, because honeybee brood is actually quite high in protein. In earlier times, but later obviously than the hunter-gatherers, when bees began to be managed, the hive of choice was the skep. And the skep was made of twisted straw. And in fact, you may not be aware, but straw was twisted into ropes quite commonly on farms and used to hold down covers on haycocks and stacks of grain. So the twisted straw was bound together with strips. You can see here the darker material, which was probably strips of bramble or similar. And the skeps went on to be evolved, and we have a more sophisticated skep here, obviously a bigger one. It's brand new, it's a showpiece. But you'll notice the smaller basket on top, and skeps in Scotland, by the way, were called ruskies. And the top one is called an eek. And yes, that's where the expression to eke it out comes from. Precisely that. Skeps varied in size. Around about 1900s, a gentleman called Pettigrew, and I suspect this one here, the big one, is a Pettigrew, realized that putting or allowing bees to have bigger hives reduced the risk of swarming. But ironically, skep beekeeping actually depended on swarming. And the swarms were highly prized. They were carefully captured and then popped into a fresh ruskie to set up a new colony. The honey was harvested by either drumming the bees, and that was rhythmically banging the side of the skep with another container on top to drive the bees up and out of the original skep, and then the honey and the brood could be harvested. And skeps and the bees were actually highly prized. I mean, somebody has gone to a lot of expense here to build a permanent shelter for the bees in a walled garden. And this was quite common. You'll see bee balls in a lot of the big house gardens. So they understood that bees were important for pollination. And of course, bees were highly prized, both for the wax and for the honey. Now, the important point and the main point I'm trying to drive home in today's talk is bee space. Bee space is a magical number of a gap between combs of between 7 and 9 millimeters. And you can see here on these various containers and the 4 skeps Doesn't matter the orientation of the combs or how they've been laid out by the bees. There is a gap between the combs of precisely that number. And why is it that number? Very simple. It's the space for two bees to work back to back. Legs facing that way, legs facing that way. So, another example, this is a swarm obviously working and building brand new comb. This is what we call virgin comb. You can see how bonny and white it is. And again, the gap is being adhered to, and it's always adhered to. It is one of the few things that bees can be depended upon to do precisely. Now, right, you say, what happens if the gap is bigger than 9 millimeters? And also what happens if it's smaller? Well, if it's bigger, the bees will make what we call brace comb. In other words, if the gap is unacceptably big, it gets filled. They don't waste space. And you can see hard surface here. You can see there's a little bit of sealed brood on the comb there. But this gap is too big, and they've started to build this extra comb, this brace comb, to fill the space. So if you inadvertently leave a comb out from your colony, you can bet your bottom dollar when you go back from either the bottom bar of the comb above or from the crown board, if the crown board happens to be the nearest hard surface, they will build a comb down, wild comb, brace comb, to fill that space. They will not tolerate a big space in the colony. And if it's too small, well, welcome to propolis. Now, propolis, and this is it being gathered or brought to the hive on the pollen baskets of a worker bee. Propolis is most commonly seen in your garden on a hot day, pardon me, on the bark of cherry trees, or gean trees as we call them in Scotland. And it's that sticky stuff that oozes out from the trunk of the tree. And I dare say you've had a row from your mum because you were curious and you stuck your finger in it and you pulled your finger away and this strand of stickiness came with your finger, and then you went like that and you had it on your two fingers plus your thumb, and then you thought, ugh. So you tried wiping it on the hanky. Maybe you didn't have a hanky, so you rubbed it, you know where, yes, on the seat of your trousers. And you got a row, and justifiably, because it's the most difficult stuff to get rid of. It really is. Now, bees actually, and to me, it's almost magical that they can do it. They grab it with their mouth parts, and it doesn't stick to them. And they transfer it to their pollen baskets, and they take it to the hive, and they are divested of it by the house bees, and it is used in the colony. What is it used for? Now, this is where it gets interesting. Propolis is actually a natural disinfectant. It is also antiviral, and it is also antibacterial. It's pretty powerful stuff. And what the bees do with it is, first and foremost, they varnish the inside surfaces of the colony with it, including the brood box. They make it a sterile environment with regards to nasties. If you get an intruder in the colony, say a mouse, and the bees kill it, they will encase it in propolis to stop the decomposition from adversely affecting their environment. It's really quite an astonishing substance. And bees actually hate anything loose in the colony. They absolutely detest it, and they will stick things down, as you will find out. And this is a frame. It's a Manley frame with the wide sidebar, but you can see, if I take it close to the camera, you can see the red there. That is propolis. And one of the problems with Manley sidebars, whilst they're brilliant for producing comb honey, because the nice deep combs, they fit into the little packaging very nicely. The problem being these flat surfaces do get stuck together, and getting frames out of a super can actually be quite problematic sometimes. So they stick everything down. They also use it to fill that gap, the sub 7 millimeter. They will propolize it up. And they will also use it if they think the front door is too drafty, they'll modify it. Propolis, gap into the colony. And you'll notice the flat area there and there. You know what that's for? That's for disinfecting the feet of all the flying bees coming back to the colony. It's a biosecurity door. Ingenious or what? So everything in beekeeping, if you imagine beekeeping being an upturned pyramid, everything involved in the management of bees stands on the tip of that inverted pyramid, and the word it stands on is bee space. Now, a modern hive consists of a roof working from top down, a roof, a crown board, super plus multiple supers, brood boxes, floor, and in between the brood boxes and supers, normally there would be a queen excluder. Working the other way around, floors come in two types, solid and ventilated. And people nowadays have it in their heads that ventilated floors, or OMF, open mesh floors, are there for reasons of varroa, which is the pest that we'll be discussing in some detail later on. In actual fact, no. Ventilated floors were initially invented, is probably the right word. They were invented by Bernard Mobus from Craveston, and he did the research into improving wintering, and his conclusion was that the best way to winter bees was on an open mesh floor with insulation above the crown board. Unfortunately, not long after his research was published, varroa arrived in the UK, and people thought, if varroa should accidentally fall off the bees, then it would be extremely handy if we had a mesh floor, the varroa drop through the floor, and they can't get back up onto the colony, onto the bees. And the rationale for this floor has been lost, but not by everybody. Brood box, this one is a polystyrene version. Terminology can be a little confusing. I call them brood boxes, some people call them deeps. I call supers, and some people call them shallows. But shallow, super, same thing. Brood box or deep, same thing. However, just to add another layer of complication, there are hives which come in deep versions. So you can get XYZ deep, which is to say it's an inch or 2 inches deeper than the normal one. It's all very confusing in the UK, sadly. Queen excluder is a mesh like this. It can be made of plastic. It can be, in this instance, galvanized steel. It can be the Waldron version, which are wires which are set into a wooden frame. Top B space, bottom B space comes into play with regards to queen excluders, but we'll touch on that in a minute or two. Polystyrene super, crown board. Now, this is something that really annoys me, to be honest. I raked round the manufacturer's websites for this photograph, and every one of them had only got crown boards with these holes in them. These white things are called Porter B escapes, and they're about 1/8 of an inch overlapping the ply. So you've got an oval hole in the plywood. And the reason for these holes is A, so that the manufacturers can sell you Porter B escapes, which frankly are pretty useless because they depend on little metal springs, and the springs come together like this, and the bees go down through the hole, they come to the spring, they push their way through, and it acts like a one-way valve. Well, that's fine. And if they are nice and new and clean, they work to a point. Mr. Drone has a nasty habit of blocking them. If, on the other hand, they're a little bit grubby, or they're on for too long, or the bees get access to them in the wrong way, then the bees will, guess what, they'll propolize them up. And the other reason that the manufacturers put these holes in is people like to feed little dribbles of syrup or little bits of fondant over them. So I'm going to be brutally honest with you, and I'll be talking about this in episode 3 of the course. If you're going to feed, feed. And by that, I'm talking about feeding in multiple liters or gallons or kilos of fondant, and not in grams, as in 250 grams or a margarine tub full. I've seen people time after time after time saying, oh, I fed my bees last Sunday, I looked this Sunday, and my goodness, they'd taken it all. Do you know what? If they'd looked on Tuesday morning, more than likely all that fondant would have gone. And that is dangerous, because here's somebody who's quite confident in their own mind that they are doing a grand job of feeding the bees. In actual fact, are only doing a fraction of what they think they're doing. And therein lies trouble. As I say, if you're going to feed, feed. Don't play at it. I don't use crown boards for feeding. I do have one crown board like this, but it's got a solid crown board on top of it, and it's in the process of being changed out. All my crown boards are solid. So how do I feed? Simple. I have eeks, square eeks made to fit the colonies, and I make them out of scrap insulation material. They are 2 inches deep. They are glued and screwed, as in they are butt jointed. Grabs a bit of paper on a pad, as in like so. And I use wood glue, Loctite 3 as it happens, and one screw in. It's all it needs. And I've got eeks. They're getting a bit shabby now, to be fair, but I've had 10 years out of them for the sake of nothing, apart from the cost of 4 screws and 4 dabs of glue. And I put my fondant directly on top of the top bars, and I'll be covering this again, but I'm just emphasizing it, and repetition helps the old brain box take it in, so that if the bees get into really cold weather and they cluster really tightly, they are never more than an inch or so away from that fondant. Whereas the crown board above the bees, and you've got the bee space between the crown board and the top bars, and the bees are a bit down in the combs, that fondant could be 4 or 5 inches away. It might as well be on Mars if it's really, really cold. Right, moving on. Roofs can be flat or gabled. I prefer flat roofs as I can turn them upside down and put supers on top of them. You can't do that with a pretty gabled roof. You imagine that upside down, it's going to tip. If you've got a weight of supers, they're liable to slide off. Can cause a bit of grief. Quite expensive, these gabled roofs, by the way, £57 plus. A Bonnie Timber National roof, they're still quite expensive, 47 odd pounds. It's an item that you can make and save quite a lot of money. Now, when people shout Eureka, they tend to get their names in the history books. Archimedes did quite successfully. Discovered displacement. And another gentleman shouted the same thing and took out a patent. We'll come to him in a minute. The Stuartan hive is, as the text says, it was designed in 1819. Note the date, please. 1819. There were no corners for stagnant air to accumulate. He lived in Stuartan, Ayrshire, born 1755, died 1840, and the hive name is derived from Stuartan, which was famous for making bonnets in Ayrshire. Now, the Stuartan hive looked like this, and it had little slide outs that you could peep through to have a look at the bees. And bear in mind, back then, that was a serious novelty. People just had never had the opportunity to actually see a colony working. And these slats at the top had the combs hanging down from them. So it was the first, arguably, movable frame hive that we know of. And it produced most excellent results. In the Iparian exhibition at the Crystal Palace, I love this little story, 1874, a magnificent display of the finest white clover honey was made in the Stuartan supers. The purity, quantity, and beautiful regularity of the combs were worthy of the prize and general high commendation. The lads from Stuartan scooped all the prizes, comb honey, and off they went, back to Stuartan. But they'd only exhibited the second best honey down at the exhibition in London. They kept the best for the forthcoming local show at Stuartan, where the real competition was to be found. Now, beekeeping in general, just a little warning, please. We have got so many bright ideas. We've got so many gizmos. We've got so many different types of hive in the UK. Whatever you do, I don't care how brilliant it seems, please stick it in the pipe. The wheel already exists and there are more than enough variants already. So whatever the bright idea is probably already been tried. Sorry. And there's far too many hive types already in the UK, which leads to the prices that they are. Sad but true. And that leads us to Reverend Langstroth. 5th of October, 1852. Note the date, the difference between that and Stewarton, right? Langstroth received a patent on the first movable frame beehive in America, aka the world. Repeatedly, he started with wooden boxes used to transport wine. A friend of his, Philadelphia cabinet maker, Henry Burquin, made Langstroth first hives for him, and by 1852, he had more than 100 of them and began selling them. And the Langstroth is the dominant hive around the world. There are variants on the original. Australia has one, I believe there's one in Canada, one in New Zealand, but the thing about that is a local variant, the hive maker can set his machinery to make that variant size, whatever it might be. And once he's set his saw and he's going to cut 10,000 units, he just cuts 10,000 units. It's straightforward. In the UK, it's so many of this. Oh, now we've got an order come in for 100 of this. Oh, hang on a minute, we've got another order come in for 500 of that. And they are forever chopping and changing the machinery to suit. And this is time, and time is money, and money has to be recouped. Hence the price of the stuff in the UK. (1851), although I suspect it could be earlier than that, Langstroth noted the 9 mil magic number. So we're talking 9 mil here and 6 mil, but to be honest, I think it's 9 and 7 is probably closer. And that was bee space, as we've already discussed. And it is the most common movable frame hive in the world. There are variants, as I mentioned. And this is what it looks like. That's the Langstroth frame, and you'll notice it's got quite a short lug. That is a daft feeder that fits in that slot there and probably holds a pint at the most. Not really to be encouraged, because that's how to start robbing. So, and this is, looks like a swarm's been popped into this one. Dates are on the, are on the frames, and you can see the short lugs. Now, the lugs that are normal on the national hive are as follows. The sidebar, let me just squeeze it on for a minute. Sidebar fits like that. The lug is fully, I can't remember the exact number, but I'll tell you it is, and get the ruler the right way around. 1 3/4 inches. So there's quite a difference between the national lug and these. And people who are used to the national say, oh, I can't deal with Langstroth frames, the lugs are far too short, I can't get a grip of them. Well, not being funny, the rest of the world seems to manage perfectly well. It's only us fumble-fingered Brits that have the issue. So, hives in the UK, the most common one of a lot is the national. And probably the timber national is still the most common, but it is slowly but surely being taken over by the polystyrene types. I said things happen very slowly in beekeeping. The polystyrene hive is now the exception. I ran a poll on a very popular site quite recently, and I was astonished that 18% of the respondents, and there was over 500, pardon me, said that they were fully polystyrene, and a staggering 60+% said that they had at least one polystyrene nucleus in their possession. So polystyrene is becoming very popular, and for good reason. The classic hive, if you say to anybody unconnected with beekeeping, draw me a hive, it's this one. the WBC. It's a double-walled hive, which is to say that these three bits here, which are called lifts, are taken off, and inside there's a little skinny brood box which takes 10 combs. WBC, named after William Broughton Carr, C-A-R-R, who was the gentleman who invented it. The Scottish version is called the Glen, and it was devised by Dr. John Anderson of Crabston. And again, it's exterior lifts, interior brood box, but Anderson didn't set it out as a fixed plan. He set it out as an idea, really. He said, look, you can do this, but you can make it any size you like. It all depends what wood you've got to hand. And you get them with 15 frame brood boxes, you get them with 25 frame brood boxes, just whatever the gentleman or the lady who made it had. I actually had 2 in my early days, and I bought them from a gentleman who had 100 of them at the back of his house in the village of Dinnet, which is just inside the Highland boundary between Ballater and Braemar, Royal Dee side. And these hives, the bees flew across the River Dee to the south and worked on the heather on the hill there. When I met him, he was winding down because he was getting on a fair bit. But he had produced a great deal of honey in his time. He'd built an extension to the house on the backs of the bees. He ran his car on the backs of the bees, and he supplied Fortnum's and Mason. So he got a good price for it. The Glen floor, the bees, this was the entrance here at the bottom. They ran up a slope, and they came out at this gap here. And whether it was deliberate or not, it actually worked as a very good wasp floor because it enabled the bees to have a very defensible entrance. There is a gentleman relatively recently has brought out plans for a national floor on exactly the same principle as an anti-wasp floor. As I said to you earlier on, don't bother inventing it. It's already been invented, if not by you, by somebody 50 odd years ago. The Scottish version of the Langstroth is the Smith, and Mr. Smith from Inverleithen wanted to simplify the national, because the national, if you look at the brood box, has got a big sheet of wood on one side, a big sheet of wood in the other, slightly smaller back and front, and 4 bits of wood which are jointed in, and that piece there is actually angled. It's not flat, it's angled, so it's been machined on the angle, obviously. So a fairly complicated, if you haven't got a decent table saw, it's a fairly complicated piece of joinery. So Willie Smith decided he wanted something simpler. He came up with this. It's the frame it takes is the same as the national hive, but with a shorter lug on the frame, same as Langstroth has got a short lug. They're still relatively common in Scotland. Some of them are even across the border, but it's never been a majorly popular hive. And lastly, these are coming in. This is a Maysmore version of a 6-frame nucleus hive, floor, brood box, in this case brood box again, little feeder on top, and the roof. The green things to one side, by the way, are frame feeders, which substitute for a frame in any national colony because they are national frame feeders. So this takes us to what size are the different hives. This cell count refers to the amount of cells in the brood box, assuming one brood box, okay? So the WBC, 45,000, the National and Smith, 50,000, Langstroth, 61,400, commercial, 70,500, and modified Dadant, 85,000. Modified Dadant in Scotland, you can pretty much forget about. It's far too big, and our colonies don't expand to use it properly, and they tend not to thrive that well in it. No doubt somebody will mail me to say, oh, I've got 1,500 of them and they're absolutely fine. Well, you know, there's an exception that proves the rule. In general, the really big colonies, big hives don't do so well in our climate. So, cells per frame. The national frame is roughly 4,500 cells. Bigger frames in bigger hives have more cells and are consequently heavier. And this is something to bear in mind, because not everybody is competing for the strong man of Britain. So the weights, not mine post lockdown. A full national super is roughly 40 to 50 pounds, 30 pounds of which is honey. Now, to be honest, that would be, in the vernacular, stuppet foo, stuffed to the gunnels. Absolutely full, side to side, top to bottom. If you say, as a rule of thumb, that a national super is 25 pounds, you probably won't be that far off the mark. So a full national hive plus brood plus roof is 80 pounds. But in actual fact, in reality, when you're moving hives, you don't move them with the roof on. So you are looking at, again, let's just say roughly 70 pounds, but then you've got the empty brood box, which is, let's say, 20 pounds. So you're still looking at 90 pounds. It's a weight. It is a weight. It is hard work shifting them. Now, I sent out the mail with the Thorns catalogue as the attachment, and I will repeat, I am not endorsing Thorns as the be-all and end-all of suppliers. It was merely a handy vehicle for the information I wanted you to have a look at. So there's two main groups of frames. There are deep brood box frames, and there are super, which are the super frames. Now, a Langstroth frame, for example, will not fit into a Langstroth. A Langstroth frame will not fit into a national. A national frame will fit in a Langstroth, but it will leave masses of wiggle room, which will promptly be filled with brace comb. So in other words, you need to buy the right frames for the right hive. So DN4, the N4 refers to the width of the top bar. You get N5s, which are slightly wider, and they were devised to theoretically reduce brace comb. Personally, I've never seen bees building a lot of brace comb between the top bars, so it's not something I worry about. The D for deep, S for shallow, the N4 is the width, so that is the explanation for that bit of code. People do find it a bit bewildering when they look at the different frames. So frame parts. We have got, and I'll just get me bits ready to show you. The top bar comes with the frame wedge as part of it. You can see the saw cut there. And what you do to separate out the wedge is you either pick it out with your thumb, or if it's well and truly stuck, use a craft knife. There's the blade, there we go. A knife just to cut it. and I'll show off here. Years ago, I was friendly with a gentleman who worked for the Camelius Knife Company in America. And one late autumn, he said to me, I really admire your labels, Pete. Can you send me across the labels you're using? And I said, yeah, by all means. I shoved them in the post, never thinking twice about it. And this was my Christmas present. Scottish Heather honey on the one side, and I was running at the time out of Stonehaven, Staying Highway Pures, and it is a multi-blade knife. He also sent me another one with my Blossom label on it. Really rather nice, quite pleased with these. So the wedge bar comes integral with the top bar. For a brood frame, you have two sidebars and you have two bottom bars. Now, I buy my frame parts as parts. So I'll buy 200 or 300 top bars. I'll buy 200 or 300 sidebars. I do buy occasionally bottom bars, but if I have the right timber to hand and I've got the time, I make my own. I also cut my own spare wedge bars, because if you're repairing or refreshing frames with new foundation, it's not uncommon to break the wedge bar, so it's handy to have a few spare, because obviously buying in the top bars, they come with their own wedge bar, so I haven't got any spares as such. So as I say, I buy in the parts. What's not on the list is frame nails, and this is a frame nail, which is, I'm trying to hold it in such a way that you can see it. It's a diddy little nail with a diddy little head on it. The head's about 2 millimeters across. These are 18 mil long, and technically they're not called frame nails. They are GIMP pins, G-I-M-P space P-I-N, GIMP pin. And you buy them from the manufacturers. They've gone up in price shockingly, actually, just recently. 500 grams is now, I thought I saw a price on this, so I'm just looking at the packet of, there it is, £8.50, 500 grams of GIMP pins. Now, some people glue their frames together and some people don't. Personally, I don't. If you are gluing it, you are saying, I'm going to scrap the entire comb plus the frame if it gets damaged. By having my nail together and not glued, if I break something, if the sidebar gets damaged or the bottom bar gets damaged, I can take them off, I can replace them. So it's up to you, glue or not glue. Super frames. Now, usually they are self-spacing on the basis of the Hoffman, and I should have said these shape of sidebars are called Hoffmans because of the self-spacing here. The super ones are exactly the same, they're just smaller, as in, let's see if we can manage this. Yeah, there's the brood at the bottom and there's the super at the top. So you can see there is quite a difference. The Manley frames I showed you earlier, I'll just hold it up again. It's the same depth of frame as the Hoffman sidebar. It's just wider and it doesn't swing in, and it's ideal for cut comb production. super frames are usually self-spacing, Hoffman or Manley. That actually, I was thinking about this when I was walking the dogs today. I should say there are two other methods of spacing. One is called castellation, and it is a metal strip that is nailed to the end of the super, and it's got a slot and a bit of metal that sticks up, just like a castle wall, you know, with spaces in braziers, isn't it? Technically, you call them, for people to shoot through, not the arrow slits, but the actual gaps in the wall. The only problem with them, if you go for castellations, is if you want to move the frames in the super, you've got to pick them out and move them and drop them in. You can't just push the whole body. Personally, I don't like it. I said that to a bee farmer down south, and he gave me a very dirty look. He said, all my supers are castellated. And I thought, oops. Well, you know, each to their own. The other, now very much out of date way of doing it, but you can still buy them, is spacers. And the spacers they're now made of plastic. They're horizontal, like almost like Lego blocks in a way. They've got a hole through the end for the lug there. They slide on and they space. Some people swear by them because you can slide them in such a way that you can slip them by each other, so you can get the frames closer together, which some people say is a great way of getting the combs drawn out. I think they're an absolute pest, but that's my opinion. You might find they're absolutely ideal for your purposes. So I'm just making a point of mentioning them. Super frames used for heather production or something is wired to increase strength to resist the needling required, and these supers need needling because heather honey, I'm assuming you're not pressing, which is the other way of extracting heather honey. Heather honey is thixiotropic, which means it has to be agitated to turn it into a liquid to temporarily enable it to flow when it's being spun. We'll get back to heather honey and its properties later on. At the minute, let's concentrate on our frames. So what goes into the frame is called foundation. Now, some people don't use foundation. They use starter strips and they let the bees draw the wax out themselves. You end up with a very fragile comb. Personally, I like using foundation, and in the broods and the supers, I like using wired foundation. But before we get to that point, I'm going to show you how I assemble a frame. You take the top bar and you take your side bar, this is the brood one, and you slide it in. Now you will notice there is a flat and there is a point. When I put the other sidebar on, you won't be able to see it probably in the camera, but this one is flat and the right hand side has got a point, which means that facing me on the left, I've got a point, on the right, I've got a flat. Facing you on the right is a point and the left is a flat. The reason for this is when these are, and I'll use the super one to make the point, the brood, flat, the super one has got a point, but this is how they sit. They sit point to flat. Whether in the brood box or whether in the super, the sidebars sit flat to point or point to flat, whichever way around you want to look at it. The point being minimizes the surface contact area and therefore the propolization. We're back to our old friend again. Propolis has got a lot to answer for in beekeeping. Back in the day, a few years ago, when people were going on about the slightly saucy postcard type t-shirts with do it with. You remember them? Well, the beekeeping one was beekeepers do it with sticky fingers. A sideways reference, not to honey, but to propolis. So, let me just put that in the wrong side. When I make up my frames at this time of year, ready for the season to come, this is how far I build them. I have my wedge bar is out, side bars, bottom bar. I put a pin in from the bottom bar that way into the side bar. I have a pin from the flat into the top bar, and the opposite side, the flat into the top bar. Some people put another vertical pin from the top bar through into the side bar for extra security. And that's where I leave them. I wax them basically at the last minute. And I've put the bottom bar in that is furthest away from the recess, so that when I come to add the foundation, it's easier just to lay it in. Now, your foundation will come with wired through. You can see the wires, that's the dark bit, my finger moving through the light there. It will come with a big loops on one side and a little loops on the other. Big loop. Then you can see it. Little loop here, just there. The big loop end, you bend at right angles. We see it? Yeah, that's it, bent at right angles, yeah. And that sits into and I've got to admit, it's a lot easier doing this in a classroom situation than it is on camera, but we will persevere. So the wax fits into the groove in the sidebar, and the loops are now against where we've taken out the wedge bar. And the wedge bar goes back in and it traps these loops you can just see the loop there protruding. And they are secured in turn by a pin that goes in at 45 degrees, goes through the wedge bar, through the loop of the wire and into the top bar. Three pins. And that's the wax secured. And then you would put in the second bottom bar. There are videos on YouTube. And I can hear some of you saying, thank goodness for that. It's one of these instances where a video is worth 1,000 words in reality. So that's how you put foundation in. And the ob story here, I mentioned, I think before, how fast bees can move. And I had an observation hive, which was one brood frame and one super frame, and it was getting a bit congested. So I took the brood frame out, replaced it with a frame of foundation. I put the colony back on its windowsill, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 10 o'clock the following morning, they had drawn out the first inch of the brood comb and laid it, the queen had laid it up, and the wax drawn out tapered down 2 inches. That's how much work a little diddy 1/5 of a nucleus colony or 1/10 of a natural colony, that's what they'd achieved in that amount of time. 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. So 4 from 12 is 8, 8 and 10 is 18 hours they'd manage that. Don't underestimate how fast bees can move. So, the big decisions. Do you want to be a conventional beekeeper or a natural one? And natural beekeeping involves not using foundation, not using, minimizing the chemicals that are used. Usually it's top bar hives, or do you want to be conventional? I would strongly suggest to you that you go down the conventional route first, get an idea of how bees behave, whether you're comfortable with them and so on, and then make that decision. Because once you've started, it's quite easy to sell off hives, but it's not so easy to sell off a top bar hive. You have to make a decision as to which bee you're going to choose. You need to make a hive choice. And that choice starts with, am I going to use timber? Am I going to use poly? And then from there, you need to decide what style of hive you're going to use, because poly comes in National, Smith, and Langstroth. Timber comes in all the variations we've already mentioned. And you also need to decide what sort of frame you're going to run. For instance, if you are going to run sidebars which are straight, therefore cheaper than the Hoffmans, you are then committing yourself to either castellation or the plastic spacers. Or you can simplify matters but pay a little bit extra money and use the Hoffman. Personally, I like a simple life. My motto is KISS, K-I-S-S, keep it simple, silly. So I use the Hoffman. Bees. There are, in the UK, 4 main strains of bee. There is Apis mellifera mellifera, the black bee, sometimes called the Scottish bee. There is Apis mellifera linguistica, the Italian honeybee. There is Apis mellifera carnica, the carniolan or grey bee. And there is buckfast, which is a hybrid. Now, this is not a minor decision. If somebody says to me that they are selling an AMM queen, Apis mellifera mellifera, I would ask to see DNA proof, because I honestly don't think you can get a pure AMM in Scotland anymore. It used to be worked out on the basis of various wing measurements and tongue measurements and so on and so forth. Then they started getting cheap DNA tests, and the DNA tests rather pricked a bubble into quite a few dreams. The Italian honeybee is probably one of the more common strains around the world, especially in the States. And I will pass on to you what I was told by a bee farmer mentor of mine back in the early days. He said, Pete, if you're going to run Italians, they're extremely prolific, but you better buy shares in Tate and Lyle, because they take a lot of feeding. They don't like working in adverse weather. When Scottish mongrels, which, sorry, are not on the list, but should be, I suppose, the sort of average Scottish bee is a kind of a black bee, and it's probably a hodgepodge of a mix, which means it doesn't breed pure, but it can be a very nice bee, can be a productive bee, but it can be an absolutely horrid bee. It's a bit of a luck of the draw situation. The Italians, fairly expensive to run in bad weather. The Carnies are very quiet, they're productive. They can get a little bit tinky, a little bit aggressive when they get to the 3rd or 4th cross away from pure carniolan, but not too seriously nasty. Buckfasts, well, they can be very nice to start with, and within 2 years or so, they can become really quite nasty. They're known for it. Not all of them. Some of them will stay quite calm, but on average, they tend to lose the pleasantness as years go by. So, big decisions. If you decide you're going to go down the likes of Buckfast, you're probably going to be buying in queens every couple of years. Buying in queens is simple. Introducing them can be a bit more difficult, and an awful lot of people lose on introduction. Right. I should have mentioned Mr. Huber earlier on. This slide is out of place. Huber did observation of, well, actually, Huber was blind. It was his servants and his wife that did the observation, and he did the thinking. Up until Huber, everybody thought that the king bee was a male. The head of the colony was a male. In actual fact, obviously it's not. It's a female, and it was only when Huber published his work that it became realized worldwide that the queen was actually female and not male. So, very important point in beekeeping. Now, as you probably know, our bees have got 3 castes, and we're starting to veer into next week's talk, but repetition won't do any harm. We have got, in the average colony, lost my cursor, here we go. In a good going colony, 60, 70,000 bees, and of them, probably all but 1,000 or so will be infertile workers. We have normally, but not always, 1 queen, and we have 1,000 or 2,000 drones. And I always think of the drones as the colony's insurance policy. Drones only have 1 mission in life, and that is to fly and mate with a queen. And that is why Mr. Drone has got whacking great big eyes, and his best line of sight is 60 degrees up, because he is sighted that way so that he can see a virgin queen on the wing, fly after her, and with a bit of luck for her, the drone mates, but he also dies at the same time. The colony likes to have a number of drones present, and as I say, they're there for insurance, because if the queen inadvertently comes to grief, usually it has to be said at the hands of the beekeeper, then the colony can raise a replacement, and they have the drones there to mate with her. Now, this is a brood frame that's in full toot. It's in full action. Top bar, side bar, bottom bar, pollen, arch. Yeah, you can see how it's swooping over the brood space. Seal brood, a little bit of open brood there, but that is quite a nice brood pattern. A brood pattern is something that you want to learn to keep an eye on, because if it's all patchy and, you know, she's been hitting and missing and just not laying at a rate of knots, which this represents, this is a queen that's been laying at some speed, then, you know, you haven't got that great a queen. This is a sort of brood pattern you want to be looking for. The pollen arch is there for 2 reasons. One, it's there to supply the bees with a ready supply of pollen to generate brood food to feed when all of these cells were full of open larvae. But it's also there as an insulation blanket. It helps to keep the brood warm. And a colony is keeping the brood temperature round about 34 degrees centigrade. This is the 17th of January, and I am 100% confident I have got brood in my colonies right now. Ambient temperature last night was down to 0. So the bees were keeping the brood at 34 degrees centigrade. That is actually some going. Some going. And they need all the help they can get. I'll remind you about the tree right at the beginning. Warmth and the insulation value of the timber. And you've seen how thin some of these timber hives are. You know, 7/8 timber. 7/8, which is what, 22 mil? It's not anything like a foot of timber, is it? So, in the spring, this is more like the picture you're going to see. This white at the top is capped stores. This could be syrup that's been stored, it could be honey that's been stored, but it has got nice bonny wax cappings across it. Helps to keep the water out. Below that, you have a pollen arch, which is there for insulation purposes. And this biscuit color here is sealed brood. And worker sealed brood, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cells to an inch. And this one, again, you've got sealed honey above. You've got the sealed worker brood. And there's been a hatch and the queen has been along and she has backfilled because all of these white are larvae. And that one there, you can clearly see, or I can, it is a small larvae floating on a white bed of royal jelly. And the royal jelly is diluted for feeding to workers and non-diluted to feed to queens. The abbreviated table of development, because there is a far more complicated one but for basic beekeeping, this is what you need to know. 3 days an egg, 5 days a larvae, 8 days pupating, and the queen emerges at 16 days. The worker, 3 days an egg, 5 days a larvae, 13 days pupating, hatches 21 days. Drone, 3 days a larvae, 3 days an egg, beg your pardon, 8 days as a larvae, 13 days pupating, and drones or boars at 24 days for emergence. Why is this important? Okay, you open up the colony, you've been away, you've come back, and there is no open worker brood. It's all sealed brood. Okay, that tells you immediately that the queen has not laid in the last 8 days. Yeah? Who was there 8 days ago? It was me, miss, it was me, Mr. Clumsy. So it's always a case of working back. You're playing detective. If you open up and there is no open drone brood, then something happened 11 days ago, and so on and so on and so on. By the way, this 8 days here, the 3 days an egg and the 5 days, critically, this 5 days here in the feeding of the queen is the equivalent of a newborn human baby becoming the size of a baby elephant in 5 days. That is how rich the food is that the worker bees feed to the queen and how much she gets fed. There's literally hundreds of feeding visits to those larvae per hour. Boy, do they get fed, and boy, do they grow. So here we have eggs, one there, there's one there, there's one there, there's one there, etc. And they are all at different angles, as we would say in the drilling game offshore. They are at different angles from the dangle being vertical, and these guys are definitely off. They're askew from the vertical. And the reason being, when an egg is newly laid, it is up and down. And as the first 12 or 18 hours or so passes, it slowly slides down until it sits level at the bottom of the cell. It then hatches, and you will get a larvae sitting on a nice small patch of royal jelly. If that was going to be a queen, the whole base of that cell would be white, flooded with royal jelly. They don't mess about when they're feeding queens. Drone brood. This here on the left are capped drone cells. And you'll remember 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the inch with the worker brood, which is what this is. And the drones, 1, 2, 3, 4 to the inch. And the drone brood protrudes above the worker brood by about that much. So it's quite distinctive. Top tip, if you see a queen cell in amongst that drone brood, ignore it. It doesn't happen often, but it is possible that they might have got desperate, or they might have made a busy mistake and tried to turn a drone into a queen. So a queen cell in amongst drone brood is suspect. So what does this queen cell actually look like? Is it distinctive? Yes, it is. Think peanut jutting out from the comb. These can be as long as 1.5 inches sticking out. And it's not the entirety of the cell, because that structure is actually covering the cell that the larvae was, the egg was laid in and the larvae began to develop in. So it goes back into the comb as well. So you will see these quite distinctively, queen cells, and we'll be talking quite a lot about them. When worker bees hatch, day 21, they struggle through the capping. There's one doing it here, there's one doing it there, and this lady is 3/4 of the way out. And they will teeter for a minute on the edge of the cell. And if the next door cell is empty, they will fall into it and start cleaning it. If they are emerging on top of sealed brood, they will totter until they find an empty cell, they'll fall into it and they'll start cleaning. I've been working with combs and I've watched bees emerge and go to work, 20-second time gap from getting out to making a start. As busy as a bee is no exaggeration. Classic photograph of a queen, and this surrounding group of bees is called the queen's retinue. and their job is to feed the queen, to take away her waste, and also to collect pheromones from her. They groom her, and then by doing the grooming, they pick up pheromones and they pass the pheromones right the way around the rest of the colony, because the bees are constantly exchanging food with each other. And so the dose of pheromone gets distributed through the whole of the colony, and everybody knows Queenie Poos is alive and well, and everything in the colony is hunky-dory. Reassurance. And this is a rather horrible frame, which is a mix of drone brood, a mix of worker brood. And that's the kind of frame that you would think about working out of the brood box. You would move it to the side, the end, so that the bees would hatch, possibly start to fill with stores, and you could then pull it out, scrap it, and replace with a frame of foundation. One last thing. I was asked, why don't I wax my frames at this time of year? And the answer is, it's very cold out in my garage and my wax is at this point in time brittle. And there's a high risk of damaging it by inserting it into frames. Now, it's expensive stuff these days. It's over £1 a sheet, brood comb. So you don't want to damage it. Something that can happen to foundation is it gets stale, it loses its scent. It can also develop something like a powdery coating called bloom, and it can look fairly horrid. If you want to refresh it, there is a very simple method. You borrow a hairdryer. And if you can see, there is now a shininess to that wax and a glorious wax smell as well. That is now fit to go into the hive. This foundation is at least 10 years old, if not older. Yes, I keep it for demonstration purposes, but I have quite a lot of it. But in all seriousness, this would go into the bees, no draw it out, no bother at all. So just because foundation looks a little bit sad, shall we say, that's no reason to dump it. You can revive it very, very quickly with a decent hairdryer. Now, I hope all of this has been of some use to you. It'll be on YouTube, obviously, because that's where you're seeing it, I suppose. And I look forward to seeing you in the Zoom meeting next week. Thank you very much for your time. I will find out how to switch this off in a minute. There we go. Thanks again for your time.